A woman sits in a narrow cell, draped in a red kimono. She holds her pen awkwardly, having never quite gotten the hang of calligraphy as a child, but nevertheless, she writes. After all, Fumiko knows her death is coming. She has just confessed to a plot to kill Crown Prince Hirohito, the soon-to-be Emperor of Japan. She isn't afraid to die. Her confession was swift, enthusiastic, and as she would later admit, she had in fact exaggerated her own role in the plot to ensure this fate for herself. But now, asked to explain her actions, she takes the time she has to write down the whole story, every experience that shaped her into the kind of woman who would think to commit such an act of treason. And she has every intention of using this opportunity to the fullest, to call attention to the injustices of Japan's authoritarian society at all levels, from the state, to the economy, to the family. Before this point, she has always been forced to moderate her own writing to avoid the imperial censors, but now, safe in the knowledge that nothing she wrote could be used against her, she freely writes what she believes, and the scandalous details of the life story which shaped her. Kaneko Fumiko was born in the Japanese city of Yokohama. The official record of her birth, written years after the fact, claims she was born on January 25, 1902, but her parents instead gave a date of July 23, 1903. This discrepancy is something Fumiko would later note as a small example of the fallibility of the state. Fumiko was born out of wedlock to Saiki Fumikazo and Kaneko Kikuno, a man from a samurai family and the daughter of peasants, respectively. Ever since the Meiji Restoration, households had been required to register all their members at a local government office. As her parents were not officially married, Fumiko was not registered as a member of her father's family, but her father's pride kept her from being registered as an illegitimate child of her mother either. As such, Fumiko remained unregistered for the first 8 years of her life. Without registration, a person's opportunities and rights were severely curtailed, as a registration certificate was required to enroll in school or gain work. Although this fact would come to haunt Fumiko later on, as a small child it made little difference to her. Although her family was fairly poor, Fumiko reported that this period of her life was a happy one. Her earliest memories, from when she was around 4 years old, revolved around being doted on by Fumikazo, who at the time worked as a police detective. She remembered him taking her to the public baths, fussing over styling her hair and eyebrows and the fit of her clothes, and carefully attending to her when she was sick. Despite their poverty, Fumi noted, her father acted as though nothing had changed from his own affluent childhood in a samurai family, pampering his daughter as he'd been pampered. The happy years didn't last though. At some point, Fumiko's father seems to have started a behavioral down spiral, though some of it might have just been a side of him Fumi hadn't witnessed at age 4. He started drinking, openly engaging in affairs, and physically abusing Kikuno. Somewhere along the line, he had lost his job with the police, and while Fumiko was never sure what he was doing instead, he spent less and less time in the house, sometimes coming back in the middle of the night drunk. On one occasion, Fumiko recalled being dragged along by her mother to retrieve him from a brothel, and on another occasion from a card game, after which he brutally beat Kikuno on the street for embarrassing him, requiring Fumi to run for help to stop him before he killed her. He would eventually begin an affair with Kikuno's sister and run off to marry her, abandoning Fumi, Kikuno, and Fumi's baby brother Ken. Kikuno would spend the next few years drifting between relationships with men who could help support her and Fumi, but who were often similarly unsavory figures to Fumiko's father, with her inevitably leaving them when they became too abusive or neglectful. Fumiko went through quite a bit of abuse at the hands of Kikuno's first new boyfriend, including being deprived of food, rolled up in a quilt and locked in a closet, and at one point being left tied up in a bundle hanging from a tree, though it was only when he stole Fumiko's school funds to go out drinking that her mother finally left him. During this period, the family was in dire poverty. Kikuno had to send Ken to live with Fumiko's father, and at one point even contemplated selling Fumi to a brothel owner, though she gave up on this plan after learning that Fumiko would be sent too far away for her to visit. Oftentimes they missed meals for entire days, and at one point Fumi recalls eating burnt rice out of a garbage heap in the street just to ease her hunger. Fumiko's one respite during this period was school. Fumiko loved school, being both an intelligent student who performed well in a variety of subjects, and a lonely kid in need of friends. Although she had to miss classes whenever she needed something like a new notebook to allow her mother time to save up, she managed to keep up, being quite academically skilled despite her circumstances. However, one looming issue was her registration status. As an unregistered youth, she wasn't technically allowed to attend, and while her mother was able to convince principals to let her attend classes, she wasn't able to collect report cards or graduation certificates. Fumiko's life changed again when Kikuno and her then-boyfriend, who Fumi calls Kobayashi in her memoirs, managed to save up enough money to move to Kobayashi's home village in the mountains of Yamanashi Prefecture. When Fumi's family arrived, there were no houses available for them, but the villagers decided to clean up an old abandoned woodshed for them to live in. The building had fallen into serious disrepair, with rotting floorboards and a leaky roof, but with some new boards, a fresh coating of mud-based plaster on the walls, straw stuffed into the cracks, and a hole cut into the floor to install a hearth, it became livable. Even with the repairs, it was quite a ramshackle living arrangement, without even a door and with no way to completely keep the snow out during the winter, but they were able to make do. In her memoirs, Fumi described the village in some depth. It consisted of 14 or 15 families, all of them related to each other in one way or another. Situated to the south of a high mountain, the village got plenty of sunlight, and gardens carved into the side of the mountain were used to grow barley and vegetables to provide some of the food the villagers needed. Although the local diet was fairly simple, consisting mostly of coarse rice mixed with barley, unseasoned vegetables, and occasionally heavily salted fish, the villagers were kept healthy by supplementing their diets with fruits and nuts gathered from the mountainside. Fumiko credited life in the village with giving her an abiding love of nature, from foraging in the mountains and passing through the woods each day on the path to school. She described village life as an ideal way of living, healthy and close to nature. And yet, she also saw deep issues within the village. One of her central criticisms was what she saw as the corrupting influence of money. Although they were able to grow and forage some of their food, the villagers were not fully self-sufficient, being unable to produce their own clothes, and growing no rice of their own. In order to fill their needs, therefore, the village needed to buy goods from traders, in what Fumiko identified as an unequal exchange. Its primary industry during the spring and summer was silkworm cultivation, for which mulberry bushes were grown in the gardens. In winter, the men of the village would go into the mountains to manufacture charcoal, the largest source of income for the village. Traders would visit from cities, buying charcoal and silkworm cocoons, before turning around to sell clothes, rice, and other goods. While Fumi argued that a village which produced so much silk should be able to clothe all of its residents in fine clothing, instead, the silkworm cocoons were sold to buy striped cotton country clothes, worth far less than the silk cloth that would ultimately be made from the cocoons. Fumiko further described how the traveling salesmen were masters of advertisement and bargaining, skillfully convincing village women that they had to buy expensive items. As such, Fumi described how the wealth was perpetually drained from the countryside, as the meager money earned through selling raw materials was quickly spent on manufactured goods brought in from the cities. In this, she described a relationship between the cities and countryside noticeably similar to the one between imperial powers and their colonies. Fumi also identified issues with the internal economics of the village. While money was rarely used within the village, monetary value was still recognized, with transactions being filled with barter. In order to buy anything they needed for school, children had to carry heavy bags loaded with charcoal to the store. Additionally, Fumi saw a certain level of corruption within the village. While her teacher had warmly welcomed her into school, and promised her a certificate despite her unregistered status, claiming that things were done differently in the countryside, she was left humiliated when the certificate was publicly refused to her because her mother hadn't presented a gift of sake to the teacher. Afterwards, Kikuno apologized and promised to go to the teacher with sake to get Fumiko the certificates she'd worked for, but Fumi refused. She'd already been humiliated, and refused to give the teacher his satisfaction. Several days after this event, Kikuno's brother arrived in the village. Kikuno, miserable in her poor circumstances, had written to him on their first New Year in the village, hoping her family would sweep in to help her, but deep snow had kept him from coming. When he finally reached them, however, Kikuno greeted him with tears of joy, and he invited the family to accompany him back to Fumiko's grandparents. After her time in the village, Fumi moved in with her mother's parents, while her mother remarried and went to live with her new husband, leaving Fumiko feeling abandoned just as when her father had left. During this time, they received a visit from Fumiko's paternal grandmother, Mutsu. Mutsu lived in the Japanese colony of Korea with Fumiko's aunt. Her wealth showed in both her fine clothes and on her face, which Fumi described as healthier looking than her other grandmothers, despite both women being of similar age. Mutsu explained that her second youngest daughter had struggled to have children, and that when Fumiko was 3 or 4, she'd made an agreement with Fumikazo that if she weren't able to have any kids of her own, she would adopt Fumiko instead. The plan had frozen when Fumikazo and Kikuno had separated, as the family had lost track of Fumiko's location. But after she'd come to live with Kikuno's family, it was resurrected. Mutsu presented Fumi with luxurious clothes of silk and satin, and promised her and her family that in Korea, she would never be forced to do anything she didn't want to, and would be given anything she desired. She further promised to send Fumi to school, and said that if she graduated as expected, she'd go to a girls' high school, and from there be sent to college in Tokyo, at which point she'd see them once again. It seemed clear to the family that Fumiko's life in Korea would be far better than anything they could give her, so it was quickly agreed that she would be sent with Mutsu, after one little problem was sorted out. Fumiko's unregistered status would threaten the standing of her father's family, so to hide her illegitimate birth, she was registered as the youngest daughter of her maternal grandparents. With this, she accompanied Mutsu back to Korea, sent off on a clear day with the blessings and joyful tears of all her family members.
Fumiko's new home was in the Korean province of Chungcheongbuk-do, in a village called Bugang, situated alongside the Seoul-Busan Railroad. The majority of the population was made up of Koreans, with only about 40 Japanese families. The two groups occupied two separate spheres, with their own political officials and very different class characters. The Koreans were just average people, and colonial subjects, whereas the settlers were largely wealthy and money-focused agents of the empire. Fumiko noted that money was everything among the settlers. They had come to Korea for profits, and were bound together only by wealth and status, with no community spirit to speak of. Although generally wealthier than the Koreans, even among the Japanese there was an economic hierarchy. The wealthiest and most powerful among them owned large plots of land, which served as their main source of income, while the police, station master, doctor, and teachers formed a slightly lower class, and the rest of the Japanese community, who worked as store owners, farmers, and construction workers, sat at the bottom, just above Koreans. This lower class would be included in Japanese-only events, but only as onlookers, while members of the higher class took center stage. Fumiko's aunt's family, the Iwashitas, were among the more influential families in the village. They owned 5 or 6 tracts of wooded land, as well as paddy and dry field plots which they rented out to Koreans. They invested the rent money into high-interest loans, also to Koreans, to increase their profits. Shortly after Fumiko's arrival in Korea, it became apparent that Mutsu had no intention of holding to any of her promises. Not only did she not receive any of the fancy clothes and toys she'd been promised, but her grandmother refused to publicly acknowledge her as a relative, instead telling people that she'd taken Fumiko in out of pity from a poor family she barely knew, and threatened that, "As far as the register goes, you're absolutely unrelated to us, so if the truth comes out, you and your family will all have to dress in red," referencing the red clothing of prisoners. Mutsu would constantly hold Fumi's unregistered status over her head, telling her that being unregistered was as good as not being born, and accusing her of insufficient gratitude if she requested anything after the Iwashita's noble acceptance of Fumi into their own registry book. Needless to say, although the family would expect Fumiko to act according to the noble standards of their line, they would never treat her as one of their own. Fumiko's one solace in this period was that she was able to regularly attend school and, much to her joy, was enrolled under the name of Iwashita Fumiko, though with the threat that she would lose her access to the family name if she did anything to embarrass them. This one joy was made frustrating for her by the arbitrary rules the Iwashitas placed her under, however. She was given a room in one of the outbuildings to study in, and ordered to go there after every school day to review her readings, spending an hour on each subject. This review was mind-numbing for Fumi, who had always excelled in school despite her disadvantages due to her bright mind and strong memory. By the time she was in 3rd grade, she was already reading at a high school level. She never had any difficulties in mathematics, and she was able to memorize songs with only a few listens. Although she at first tried to do as she was told, she quickly bored of spending hours each day going over content she had already taken to memory. She told her grandmother that she didn't need the review, but was told that "you're not with poor folks like the Kanekos anymore, and you're not going to get away with lazy ways like one of them." When she requested more challenging books instead, her grandmother reprimanded her for talking back and insisted that her school books were all she could handle. Naturally, the young Fumiko couldn't help but let her mind wander, and took to playing with her ball or making dolls during her allotted study time. After Mutsu caught her playing several times through random check-ins, however, Fumi's study time was taken away, and she was stripped of the Iwashita name from the start of 5th grade. Fumiko's school life was also made worse by her family's elitism. She was prevented from so much as playing with the other children after school, as Mutsu claimed that the way that they were allowed to run wild was a mark of poverty, and that it would be a disgrace to the Iwashitas for Fumi to behave in such a way. On one occasion, Fumiko's school began having students grow potatoes in order to teach them basic agricultural skills. Her teacher told the students to love every living thing, even plants, and reminded them each time he spoke of the potatoes that they should not look down on the farmers who held their lives in their hands, and Fumiko took his words to heart. Unfortunately, the Iwashitas did not feel the same way, and banned Fumiko from participating. Not only that, but Fumiko was banned from any play during school, based on the justification that her clogs might break or her clothes might fade in the sun. Looking back on this as an adult, Fumiko would say, "Adults make their children suffer for the sake of appearances, or to save themselves a little trouble. But it is the job of an adult, especially a mother, to help her child develop its natural abilities. It is a terrible wrong to deprive children of their freedom and rob them of their personalities. Let your children play as they please. To play freely on this earth is the one privilege nature has given to children. If they are allowed to play, they will grow up to be healthy human beings. Of this, at least, I am absolutely certain." From age 12 or 13, Fumiko was treated as a maid, made to perform housework such as washing rice in the cold winter air, lighting fires in the underfloor heater, cleaning out the chimney for the oil stove, and scrubbing the toilet. She faced constant abuse, including the demeaning of her grandmother for her unregistered status, accusations of ill will whenever she made a mistake, and harsh punishments like beatings, denial of food, and being sent out to stand in the cold for extended periods. One particularly bad instance came after Fumiko was caught at the house of a lower-class friend, Omaki. See, Mutsu had banned Fumi from walking with Omaki, insisting that she not be seen with people from below the family station. Fumi tried to avoid Omaki by leaving for school late or sneaking along a back path, but at times their paths collided and Fumi couldn't bring herself to push her friend away. Instead, she would simply hope that none of her family members saw her on such occasions. One day, Omaki asked for Fumi to wait for her while she picked something up from her uncle's, and the kind-hearted Fumiko couldn't refuse. After she'd been waiting a while in the summer heat, Omaki's aunt invited her inside, and while she was standing there, Fumi's own uncle spotted her while passing by. She ran home, hoping to avoid punishment, but when she arrived, her aunt and grandmother threw her to the ground, beating and kicking her. When they were done, Mutsu dragged Fumi to the grain house in the yard and locked her inside. Fumi was only released the following evening, and was then pulled out of school as punishment. She was allowed to return the next term, but in the meantime, her grade for the first term had dropped to a B, which many Asians will recognize as a fate worse than death. To make matters worse, Fumi's closest friend, Tommy, had fallen ill with meningitis, which would develop into a deadly case of pneumonia. Fumi was heartbroken, and spent the following month in a constant state of mourning. One day, Tommy's younger sister Ai came up to Fumi, and by way of cheering her up, asked if she had received the sewing box that her grandmother had sent to Fumi as a memento. Fumiko feigned knowledge to avoid upsetting the younger girl, but in reality, this was her first time hearing about the box. She would later learn that Mutsu had accepted it, but sent it to a different relative as a gift instead of passing it on to Fumi. Fumiko's heart was broken all over again. Tommy's family had been kind enough to set one small thing aside for her to remember her friend by, and even this had been snatched away. Another particularly dire instance of abuse came when Fumiko was asked to spend a day carrying around a baby for a wealthy visitor. When the visitor left the room for a moment, Mutsu quietly told Fumi, "Now, if you don't want to, just say so. Nobody's going to make you do something you don't want to." Fumiko, still just an innocent child of 12 or 13, trusted her grandmother's kind tone, and admitted that she didn't want to. The second the words left her lips, Mutsu knocked her onto the ground, stomping her with her wooden clogs. She grabbed a wooden bowl from the table and painfully ground it into Fumi's chest, before dragging her by the hair to the gate and throwing her out. Once Fumiko recovered from the stomping, she spent the rest of the day scrubbing the porch to try to win her grandmother's forgiveness, but received none. She was left outside through dinner time, and the smell of frying tempura burned her empty stomach. Eventually, she went down the road to stare into the depths of the Koreans' communal well. A kindly Korean woman came across her, and took pity, apparently aware of Mutsu's cruel treatment. She took Fumi to her home and offered her food, but out of fear of how Mutsu would react if she found out she'd accepted food from Koreans, Fumi turned down the offer. Returning home, she begged for forgiveness outside the door, but received none. She returned to her room too exhausted to even change into her nightclothes, and when she woke the next day, she didn't even have the energy to get up until lunchtime, when her late rise was simply taken as proof of her insincerity. This was the last straw for Fumiko. Starving and exhausted with no forgiveness in sight for her crime of speaking honestly, her spirit was broken. In this state, she decided her best option was to die. Fumiko first went to throw herself in front of the train, but after reaching the tracks too late, she determined to drown herself. She went to the local river and filled a bundle with rocks, tying it around her waist to weigh her down, and gazed into the dark waters of the river. She began to second-guess her decision, overcome with a sense of dread about what lay beneath, when suddenly she heard a cicada above her. Looking around, she was struck by the beauty of nature. Nature had been a great love throughout her life, from the village she'd briefly lived in during childhood, to occasional trips to pick chestnuts on a mountain owned by the Iwashitas, during which she found a brief respite from her typical life. She realized how much there was beyond her grandmother's house, and became sad about all she would be missing out on in death. And then, resting against the bough of a willow tree, she had another thought. If she were to die, what would her grandmother and the others say about her, about why she died? They could say anything they liked, and I would never be able to deny it, to vindicate myself. I cannot die now, I thought. No, I have to seek vengeance. Together with all the other people who have been made to suffer, I have to get back at those who have caused our suffering. No, I must not die. And thus, Fumiko decided she would live on, powered by pure, unadulterated spite. You may be sorry to hear that Fumiko did not get her revenge, but instead, like many other abuse victims, remained trapped in her situation, with no option but to accept her family's treatment of her. Once her primary schooling was over, her grandmother predictably refused to follow through on her promise to send her to high school, and her life only got worse once she was no longer in school. She was given little opportunity to escape her grandmother's watchful eye, and was moved to a worse room, which was called the Maid's room behind her back. She spent most of her time in this room now, working on the mind-numbing task of picking apart old kimonos, except when she was needed for work in the main house, or sent to do the shopping. She would later remark that this period turned her into a thief and a liar as well, as Mutsu's scolding whenever she spent more money than expected pressured her to begin stealing change, and later selling rice behind Mutsu's back. Also, she could pretend to have spent less money on groceries. Her life went on like this until 1919, when she was 16 years old. Her grandmother unexpectedly announced her desire to buy Fumiko a good outfit. Using Fumiko's own savings, of course. She bought a bolt of Meisen with a pattern Fumi found ugly and old-fashioned, though she of course made a show of gratitude, and sewed her a new kimono with it. The reason for the sudden effort soon made itself clear. Fumiko was getting close to marriageable age, and since the Iwashitas obviously didn't want to spend their own money on getting her married, she was being sent back to her family in Japan. Mutsu had bought the new outfit to avoid revealing her false promises, and ordered Fumiko not to mention that she'd only bought it for the trip when they arrived, claiming that she would have had all the nice clothes she'd wanted if she'd been good. With that, they set off for Japan, and Fumiko breathed a sigh of relief at escaping the personal hell she'd spent the last 7 years living through. In 1919, Fumiko boarded a ship back to Japan. Although her grandmother was sending her back simply to avoid having to arrange a marriage for the 16-year-old Fumiko, Fumi was simply relieved to be free of the family that had abused her for the previous 4 years. Yet, while she would no longer be subject to the constant verbal and physical abuse that had once driven her to plan suicide in Korea, what awaited Fumiko in Japan wouldn't be a cakewalk either. She at first returned to her mother's village. However, Fumiko soon became fed up with her mother's family, who constantly bickered amongst themselves and frustrated Fumiko's intellectual desires. Shortly afterwards, Fumiko's estranged father arrived to reconnect with her, and for a time she moved into his household. However, Fumi's life there was made uncomfortable as her father insisted that she participate in daily rituals honoring his ancestors, the Psyches. As an unregistered child, she had never been able to use the Psyche name, and on top of that, she perceived her father's beliefs as mere superstition. As such, Fumi had a hard time mustering any sincere respect for her ancestors, and loathed to bow before them, feigning feelings she didn't hold in her heart. Her relationship with her father was further strained by his choice to arrange a marriage between Fumiko and her own uncle, a corrupt priest who offered him access to the wealth of his temple. While uncle-niece marriages weren't unheard of in Japan at the time, and Fumi got on well with her uncle, she was deeply disturbed by her father's choice to, in her words, sell her just like an object to her uncle. Despite carrying on relationships with multiple other women himself, Fumi's uncle called off this arrangement after learning that Fumiko had exchanged romantic letters with a boy, claiming that the possible loss of her virginity invalidated his agreement with her father. Fumi's father reacted violently towards Fumi, and Fumi would describe their relationship from then on as being one of virtual enemies. After Fumi's father had another violent outburst in response to her criticizing his pridefulness, Fumiko decided she could no longer stand to live with him. And so, at age 17, Fumi left her father's household, and, with only 10 yen in her pocket, set out to create a life of her own in Tokyo. When she arrived in Tokyo, Fumiko set out with plans to study English, mathematics, and classical Chinese, hoping ultimately to pass the entrance exam to study as a doctor. She initially moved in with a maternal great-uncle, but grew frustrated as he continuously advised her to give up on education and focus on cultivating skills to attract a husband and marrying rich. She saw an advertisement calling for desperate students to work as newspaper sellers, and, being a desperate student, promptly applied. Through this job, she secured enough money to pay for school, lodging, and food. The job also exposed her to Christian and socialist groups, who would sometimes gather to give sidewalk sermons or speeches in the same area where Fumi sold papers. However, the work was hard, with Fumi having to stay on her feet from 4 p.m. to midnight in all weather conditions, calling out to attract customers until her throat was hoarse. Since she was up so late, Fumi would regularly end up falling asleep in her classes. Moreover, by the end of each shift, she was covered in sweat and grime, but the public baths would be closed for the night. Although her manager presented himself as saving students, Fumi would come to realize that he was getting more out of the workers than they were getting from him, taking the lion's share of the profit while they did the hard work. She moved on to other jobs, working as a street vendor and a maid, but ultimately found that as a worker she was exploited regardless of occupation or employer. Fumiko converted to Christianity for a time, becoming a die-hard believer during her most difficult times. She attended church services each Sunday and would wake up early in the morning and clean the toilet for her landlord, asking nothing in return in the name of Christian charity. And yet, for all that her friends in the Salvation Army told her that this faith would pay off, she didn't have enough money to even buy food. Looking back at this period later, Fumiko asked herself if Christian teachings were just something to anesthetize people's hearts, to numb them to the pains of the world, a sort of opiate for the masses, if you will. Fumiko would later become friends with several socialists who attended school with her, including a number of Koreans, who Fumi felt a special solidarity with since her time in Korea. Fumi would describe socialism as offering her no new information, but providing her with theory to verify what she already knew from experience. When Fumiko was 18, she would meet two people who would significantly impact her life. The first was a fellow student at English school, Hatsuyo Niyama. Hatsuyo was one of only 4 or 5 women in Fumi's class, and the two were seated next to each other when Fumi overheard Hatsuyo discussing the topic of death with another classmate. I have a lung ailment, which is why I have thought so much about death. I believe it is not so much death itself that people fear, as the pain of that instant of passing over to death. The reason I feel this way is that people are not afraid of sleep, even though the loss of consciousness in sleep is, you could say, a kind of temporary death. Fumiko disagreed with Hatsuyo's stance, and jumped in to share her own perspective. Hearing this, I vividly recalled the feelings I had experienced the time in Korea that I had determined to die. I joined the conversation to say that, based on my own experience, I thought Hatsuyo's view was mistaken. I don't agree with you. I can state from my own experience that what people fear in death is the loneliness of having to leave this world forever. Though people may not be consciously aware of all the phenomena around them under normal circumstances, the thought that that which makes them themselves will be lost forever is a terribly lonely thing. In sleep, that which is ourselves is not lost, merely forgotten. While on reflection, Fumi would say she no longer believed that either of them were fully correct. The discussion is what prompted her to grow closer to Hatsuyo, who would go on to introduce Fumiko to some of her greatest influences. Hatsuyo shared books by a number of thinkers Fumi would describe as nihilists, with Friedrich Nietzsche, Max Stirner, and Mikhail Artsebachev being among the most influential on the development of Fumi's own thinking. As Fumi's thinking evolved, she began looking at her schooling differently. She had been trying so hard in her education to get ahead in life, but now began to feel that not only were her efforts in vain, but also that getting ahead wasn't really all it was chalked up to be. After all, she wrote in her memoir, is there any more worthless lot than the so-called great people of the world? What is so admirable about being looked up to by others? I do not live for others. What I had to achieve was my own freedom, my own satisfaction. I had to be myself. At the same time, despite her strong influence from socialists, Fumiko did not consider herself truly among their ranks, in part for reasons corresponding to the anarchist-Bolshevik split that was developing in Japan at this time. Socialism seeks to change society for the sake of the oppressed masses, but is what it would accomplish truly for their welfare? Socialism would create a social upheaval for the masses, and the masses would stake their lives on the struggle together with those who had risen up on their behalf. But what would the ensuing change mean for them? Power would be in the hands of the leaders, and the order of the new society would be based on that power. The masses would become slaves all over again to that power. What is revolution, then, but the replacing of one power with another? This thinking, she expressed, was influenced by Hatsuyo, who herself rejected ideas about a perfect society, and simply focused on living life for herself. However, Fumiko differed from Hatsuyo in one key respect. I felt that even if one did not have an ideal vision of society, one could have one's work to do. Whether it was successful or not was not our concern. It was enough that we believed it to be a valid work. The accomplishment of that work, I believed, was what our real life was about. Yes, I wanted to carry out a work of my own, for I feel that by so doing, our lives are rooted in the here and now, not in some far-off ideal goal. Fumiko's next important meeting during this period would be with Pak Yeol, a Korean individualist anarchist. She first heard his name when reading a short poem he'd published in a socialist magazine. Oh, what a powerful poem it was! Every single phrase gripped me. By the time I finished, I was practically in raptures. My heart leapt in my breast, and I felt as though my very existence had been elevated to new heights. Upon hearing his name, she insisted on learning more about him, and was told he was at that time out of work and drifting between staying with different friends, making him hard to get a hold of. Nevertheless, Fumi was determined. Something was stirring within me, about to be born. What was at work within this man? What was it that made him so strong? I wanted to find out and make it my own. I left Jong to go back to the shop, and on the way it dawned on me. That's it. That's what I'm looking for. The work that I want to do. He has it within him. He is what I'm looking for. He has my work. A strange joy set my heart leaping. Later, Fumiko encountered Park in a shop, and was able to ask him to come back to meet her. After they'd met several times, and had a very cute interaction I have to restrain myself not to excerpt in full here, Fumi very straightforwardly asked Park to date her. Well, I'll get right to the point. Do you have a wife? Or, well, if not exactly a wife, someone like, say, a lover? Because if you do, I want our relationship to just be one between comrades. Well, do you? Pak accepted the offer, and he and Fumi eventually decided to move in together. The pair founded a group called the Futei-sha, or Malcontent Society, mostly consisting of Koreans living in Japan, but also including some Japanese nihilists like Fumi and Hatsuyo. This organization would serve as a study group and a more direct action-oriented body within the larger Kokuyukai, or Black Friends Society, a more public-facing anarchist organization. The members of the Futei-sha began developing a vague plan for a bomb attack against Prince Hirohito, somewhat similar to the plot that led to the high treason incident around a decade earlier, which you can learn more about in my video about Kanno Sugako. As Fumi would later explain, the people of Japan had been told for generations that the emperor was divine, justifying his authority. The goal of this bombing, therefore, would be to shatter this fantasy, showing the emperor to be just as human as anyone else. Due to trust issues and internal squabbles between members, these plans never amounted to anything. However, the very fact that a plot had been hatched would impact what happened to Fumi next. In 1923, Tokyo was rocked by the Great Kanto earthquake. As discussed in my video on Ito Noe, this incident would lead to a ton of scapegoating of Koreans, and to a lesser extent leftists. In the chaos of this event, Fumi, Pak, and other members of the Futei-sha found themselves rounded up by the government. In prison, Hatsuyo, struggling with physical ailments that would lead to her death 2 months later, testified that Fumi and Pak had planned a bombing against the prince. Based on this testimony, the pair were convicted of harming the Japanese royal family, a capital offense. While in prison, Fumi and Pak Yeol officially married. Considering how little stock Fumi and Pak put into institutions, this marriage was likely intended as an ironic gesture, having the Japanese government unite them in life before uniting them in death. During her trial, Fumiko seems to have heavily played up her involvement in the bombing plot, likely hoping to ensure she shared a fate with Pak. She used the trial as an opportunity to voice her philosophy and her reasons for holding it, explaining her life experiences and how they'd shaped her viewpoint. At times, Fumiko's testimony reads as a venting of frustrations. Fumi declared that the ultimate goal of her nihilist philosophy was the negation and annihilation of all life, including her own. I don't bear a grudge against my father or mother, but it is true that much of my life was spent in extreme hardship. I was cursed by it everywhere I went, and this made me want to die as I do, annihilating everything, cursing nature, cursing society, cursing all that lives. However, in a later letter to the judge who oversaw her case, Fumiko discussed a change in her thinking. Formerly I said, I negate life, but a negation of life does not originate in philosophy, for life alone is the origin of all things. Yes, my negation of all life was completely meaningless. Negation is not created from negation. The stronger the affirmation, the stronger the negation created. That is, the stronger the affirmation of life, the stronger the creation of life negation together with rebellion. Therefore, I affirm life. I affirm it strongly, and since I affirm life, I resolutely rebel against all power that coerces life. Thus, you officials might ask, then why did you pretend you were trying to destroy your own life? I would answer, living is not synonymous with merely having movement. It is moving in accordance with one's will. One could say that with deeds one begins to really live. When one moves by one's own will, and this leads to the destruction of one's body, this is not a negation of life. It is an affirmation. Ultimately, Fumiko rejected all forms of authority wielded by the family, by capitalists, by the state, and by other ideological and religious constructs, each serving to oppress people and deny them the ability to live lives as they saw fit. To Fumiko, each of these authorities rested on deception, false concepts used to create some higher-minded justification for simple oppression. The response Fumi favored, therefore, was to reject these deceptions, embracing the ego and rebelling against all authority. Do what I am motivated to do now. This is the only maxim of my action. When a person wakes up to ego, the state falls. Quite so. I deny all the orders from outside, such as state or government, but the inner order from my own. Although Fumiko was initially sentenced to death by Japan's Supreme Court, this sentence was later commuted to life in prison. However, Fumi did not accept this fate. When presented with her imperial pardon, Fumi reacted with rage, tearing the document to pieces and proclaiming, "You toy with people's lives, killing or allowing to live as it suits you. What is this special pardon? Am I to be disposed of according to your whims?" In July of 1926, Fumiko committed suicide by hanging, rejecting the pardon in the firmest possible way. At one point in her trial, she had told the judge that, while she knew she could secure her freedom by claiming to be reformed and asking forgiveness, instead of going down on my knees before power, I'd rather die and remain true to myself. In this final act of defiance, Fumiko claimed her freedom in accordance with a poem she'd previously written. One's limbs may not be free, and yet, if one has but the will to die, death is freedom. Pak Yeol, whose sentence had also been commuted to life in prison, was freed in 1945 following the Japanese defeat in World War II, and returned to Korea, where Fumi's remains had previously been relocated. Fumiko and Pak's story would be featured in the 2017 Korean film Anarchist from Colony, which I'd recommend checking out, it's pretty good. On November 17, 2018, the Republic of Korea awarded Fumi the posthumous Order of Merit for National Foundation for her opposition to the Japanese Empire, making her one of only 2 Japanese people to earn this award. Considering her ideological beliefs, I don't think she'd particularly appreciate getting a medal from a state, but it was nice of them to recognize her. Kaneko Fumiko lived a difficult life, but this life molded her into a remarkable woman. In her final months, Fumiko expressed a variety of emotions, including plenty of rage and resentment, but also hope, love, and optimism. For all the suffering she'd faced, by the end of her life, Fumiko felt truly free, in a way that affirmed her life. She found an understanding of purpose that didn't hinge on great social change, but on being herself and acting as she saw fit, rebelling against authority to affirm her own desires. If there's one thing we can take away from the life and philosophy of Kaneko Fumiko, it's her affirmation of life, her affirmation of sincerity, and the power of truthfulness in the face of the deceptions that justify oppression. When I started writing about Kaneko Fumiko, I didn't expect to end up with 3 videos on her life, but I was so gripped by her memoir that I struggled to trim it down into a single short video. Ultimately, even here I had to leave out a lot of details. I'd highly recommend checking out the memoir if you can, as well as my other sources, listed below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting down below to help me out in the algorithm. If you can, I'd also appreciate if you'd share this video around, as that's the best way to get new eyes on my channel. Thanks for watching everybody, I've been Silma, and I'll see you next time.